Okay, there's enough people. Welcome, everyone. It is so good to have everyone here with us this afternoon as we prepare to listen in on what is promising to be a dynamic discussion. Acting up, countering racism in our communities. We have a dynamic panel for you this afternoon. This webinar is being hosted on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. Toronto is now home to many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. It is important to us at OCASI from the outset to express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including intersectional race and gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. At OCASI, we have made a commitment in our most recent strategic plan, and I quote, to be an ally by incorporating the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the calls to justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report into all of our policy and advocacy work. End of quote. OCASI has been engaged in a number of priority initiatives, including addressing racial equity in the immigrant and refugee sector through conducting an environmental scan, developing an anti-racism, confronting anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism framework for our policy and practice, as well as we continue to work with our member agencies and more lately in partnership with the City of Toronto and others to move this work forward. As part of our capacity development mandate, we have made an ongoing commitment to build our own internal capacity as well as the capacity of the immigrant and refugee serving sector to deepen our understanding of the history of the original inhabitants of this land and to build relationships of solidarity with Indigenous communities. We have done this through revising our existing course content and ensure that we include keynote speakers and guests to facilitate deep conversations at our annual professional development conferences, our national gender-based violence conferences and webinars, as well as developing 2 new courses which are specifically focused on Indigenous solidarity. And we know as a council, there is much more work we need to do as we continue to build relations with Indigenous communities across Ontario. It is important for me to remember, celebrate, and commemorate the many Black people who have contributed in building the nations of the Americas, including the Caribbean. This month, when we celebrate working women, I especially honor Black African-descended women. I acknowledge and call on my ancestors whose ingenuity and deep knowledge of self supported their survival of the brutal experience of the transatlantic slave trade and their enslavement over 400 years in these lands, including here in Canada. It is because of their struggle for liberation and freedom, a struggle that is ongoing, that I sit here today and I pay homage and give thanks. A warm welcome once again to all of you for joining us for this important discussion. This is the 3rd in our 3-part webinars on anti-racism, and today's 3rd and final installment, Acting Up, Countering Racism in Our Communities. As I said, we have a fantastic panel for you, but first, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our moderator of the series, and your moderator today, Jin He. From grassroots organizing to nonprofit leadership, Jin has supported and have led change efforts in communities, organizations, and nonprofit sectors, and collaborated with residents and decision makers across the city. Jin has over 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, with experience in community development, civic engagement, settlement, program development, sector development, and organizational development and change management. She has also worked in women's and 2S LGBTQ+ health, adult and popular education, and community arts, and was co-editor of Hankut, Hankut, Critical Art and Writing by Korean Canadian Women. Jin is currently the Executive Director of Social Planning Toronto and serves on the board of the Toronto Environmental Alliance, also known as T. Jin, welcome, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Debbie. It's so great to be here with all of you. This is our final session in the webinar and conversation series hosted by OCASI for the Ontario Immigrant and Refugee Serving sector. And I'm looking forward to diving in today with all of you and with our wonderful speakers. So the series is about moving from intention to action, and today we really focus on that action part. So we're hoping to understand systemic racism, address racial discrimination, and build towards racial equity in the sector and beyond. So throughout the 3 sessions of the series, we've had guest speakers speak about community safety, policing and alternatives, encountering hate and discrimination. And we've been talking about how this all impacts the immigrant and refugee serving sector as we work towards racial equity. And we've talked about what we're doing about it. We'll talk about that today, as well as what more we need to do. So just as a quick reminder, in the previous 2 sessions, we talked about the experiences of Black and Indigenous and racialized communities with policing and community safety issues. We shared some ideas of how to create community safety for all communities. And these ideas included enabling communities to have more say in their lives and their work, building evidence-based responses that include taking aspects such as mental health crisis intervention out of the police and investing more in community-based responses and supports that address the root causes of violence, such as unaffordable housing and poverty. And we talked about working together across communities, learning from Indigenous communities and sex worker communities who have learned to keep themselves safe and to heal, the need to focus on rights versus rescuing, and how we all have a critical role to play, whether it's in a leadership role, as a supporter, an ally, as we all learn and unlearn together in our joint group project on anti-racism and community safety. And in our second session, we learned about hate crimes from a legal, human rights, and community perspective. And in this conversation, we also talked about the need to understand and address the root causes of hate, all the forms of hate that include not just racism, but also misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and more. And we also talked about hate being the far end of the continuum that starts with bias, discrimination, prejudice, and harassment, and then which can also include genocide on the far extreme. While there are many challenges with how hate crimes are defined, challenges of low rates of reporting, the difficulties of providing proof around hate crimes, and the many challenges of combating online hate, there have been some significant gains and greater awareness amongst institutions and the public, but there's still a long way to go. We need to see broader coalition building, joint action, more resources and infrastructure to combat hate, better data collection and sharing, a more robust intersectional lens in understanding hate, for example, understanding the complexities of hate crimes against Black Muslim women, and more efforts to address hate early on at the root, including in schools and in the education system. So that's a quick review of our first 2 sessions. Today, I'm excited to dive into this conversation with our 5 guests in this third and final part of the series, where we hear from activist leaders in the Ontario immigrant and refugee serving sector, OCASI members, about some work they've been doing to counter racism. They'll talk about some of the challenges in doing their work, some of their priorities, and ideas about how we can address both reconciliation and anti-racism. And they'll share their thoughts on how others can get more engaged in anti-racism work. So before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to first start with a warm-up question for all of you. So we have a poll, a Zoom poll for you. And the question is, are you involved in any anti-racism efforts or initiatives? anywhere? So are you part of something that addresses racism? So multiple choice, yes, no, not sure. Maybe you're not sure how we're defining it. I'd say anything outside of just yourself. You part of something, an initiative, combating racism. So we'll give you a minute to respond, and then we'll share the responses. I see we have 95 attendees. Are we anywhere close to that in terms of the number of responses to our poll? Shaypreet or anyone from OCASI, are we ready to share the results?
Yeah, we can definitely share the results now.
Great. So 60% of you said yes, 27% said no, and 13% said not sure. Okay, it's always great to know who's in the room. And we have planned some conversation later in the session about what folks can do if they do want to get engaged, as well as some resources that you can take a look at after the session. So now we move on to our conversation with our guest experts. So for today, first I'll introduce the 5 speakers, and then I will give them a chance to introduce themselves and their work and or their perspectives. And then we'll have a somewhat brief conversation with our speakers, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you as well. We may not have time for more than 1, 2, or 3 questions, but we would ask you to use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to send questions to the hosts. Just a reminder, I don't think I've said this yet, we do have simultaneous French interpretation. If you needed that, hopefully you're already set up. And then we also have simultaneous closed captioning or transcription in English. So if you need either of those and are not able to access that, please send a message to Shaypreet. And there, she's just putting something in the chat there for you. So thanks for that. And then there will be a survey that's sent to you after this webinar. We really, really want your feedback. So please do complete that survey after the session. Thanks so much. So next I have the privilege to introduce our 5 speakers, Brittney, Tisha, Eternity, Axelle, and Myriam. So I'll start with Brittney Emslie, who is currently the Director of Operations at the Kitchener-Waterloo Multicultural Center, where she has spearheaded equity, anti-racism, and indigenization work. She holds a master's degree in immigration and settlement studies from Toronto Metropolitan University. And Brittney is currently the chair of the Belong Steering Group of the Waterloo Region Immigration Partnership and sits on the Waterloo Region Immigration Partnership Council and local refugee task force. She is passionate about helping immigrants and refugees settle, work, and belong in Waterloo Region. Brittney sits on OCASI's Anti-Racism Policy Advisory Board and is one of the founders of Rhythms and Blues Cambridge, a grassroots organization whose mission is to provide a safe and engaging space to empower, inform, and inspire the Black community. Brittney is actively involved in different community building events and initiatives, such as the KW Multicultural Festival, the Waterloo Region Migration Film Festival, and the hashtag Racial Equity Waterloo Region WR Public Education Campaign. Anti-racism and equity are at the center of everything that she does. Welcome, Brittney. That was the official bio. Please introduce yourself and share a bit more about your work.
Sure, thank you very much, Jen. Before I start, I would just like to begin by acknowledging that I am right now in Waterloo Region, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Chinootan people. So as Jen said, my name is Brittney Emslie. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Operations at the KW Multicultural Center. The Multicultural Center is a settlement agency with a wide range of programs, including settlement and employment supports, a conversational English program, newcomer youth programming, and interpretation and translation services. So I'm involved in leading a lot of the anti-racism and equity work within my own organization, and also through our local immigration partnership as the chair of our Belong steering group. And I'm very happy to be here today and for this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brittney. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Axelle Janczur. I've known Axelle for many, many years, but I have never asked you how to pronounce your last name, so you can let me know if I got that wrong. So Axelle's been working in the not-for-profit sector in Toronto for over 30 years, and with her practice grounded in principles of access and equity, her focus includes addressing systemic barriers to services, transformative change processes, and healthy public policy. As executive director at Access Alliance for many years, Axelle has worked collaboratively with stakeholders to prioritize capacity building to enhance services for immigrants and refugees, develop a community-based research agenda, and advocate for improved access to the determinants of health for individuals and communities made vulnerable by systemic barriers. In her personal life, she lives with a recycling enthusiast and 2 rescue cats, is mother to an extreme vegan, fixed gear cyclist, and a feminist hiker/kayaker. She still gets up every morning, thankful to be working in a mission and values-based sector. Welcome, Axelle. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jen. And I will introduce myself, and I will share just a little bit about where my head is at. I'm not an expert. I'm an old gal who's been working in this sector for a long time, and at this point in my career, I'm spending a fair amount of time reflecting. I'm happy to be here today. OCASI has always been a voice for our sector and a safe space to have important conversations. My first anti-racism workshop took place when I worked at the Center for Spanish-Speaking Peoples in the mid-'80s, and it was delivered by Tim McCaskill. Some of you may remember that name. And you know what? I still remember the discussion that day. I've seen and been part of many positive developments over the years, and I do reflect on them. We have an increasingly diverse and engaged range of populations in Ontario that are exercising their agency in whatever sector or field they're working or living. We have more and more funded agencies that are focused on vulnerable populations, ethno-specific communities, specific equity-seeking communities. Issues of racism and systemic barriers are definitely on the agenda of policymakers, funders, service delivery, and educational institutions. And we have more and more language and frameworks to support the dismantling of dominant culture systems that structurally discriminate and oppress. However, at the same time, so for many years, I could tell myself, you know, the organizations I worked with and my kids, that there was movement forward addressing racism and systemic barriers to health and well-being. However, I would say in the last 10 years, you know, the events that led up to the launching of Black Lives Matter and the backlash experienced by communities spoke to the ongoing structural and accepted violence against Black people and many others. You know, think immigrants and refugees, Indigenous populations, LGBTQ+. And the lack of solidarity between different sectors in our society. I think that was certainly one of the most discouraging aspects of that. And then all of the events since then have eroded my sense of movement forward. The impact of the pandemic on vulnerable populations has only amplified that. And, you know, the impact of the pandemic on most vulnerable populations is and continues to be the result of the structural and systemic barriers and violence against vulnerable populations that we accept. We live in an increasingly polarized society where race and money are king. This is exacerbated globally by wars, climate change, and the need for resources that makes us bury our heads in the sand and betray our principles and values. We work in a sector which unfortunately is deliberately eroded by government practices, by our funding, by the regulatory framework within which we all have to operate, and our own acquiescence to this underfunding, the unrealistic expectations placed upon us, and the excessive scrutiny that we tolerate. And we continue to work within the context of laws and policies which reinforce systemic discrimination and violence in so many ways that make us complicit. We risk a lot by resisting or speaking up, and definitely some more than others. There's no question there. And that is why these kinds of sessions are so important, to build the solidarity which is lacking and that strength of a movement. We have to share our wisdom and our knowledge and work towards building an integrated and coherent movement that will hopefully lead to change. I unfortunately am in a very cynical place right now, but hope to be able to, still talk to now my adult children and say, we got to keep pushing on this, and there is some hope. So I'm happy to be here, but that's kind of my frame of mind, having worked in immigrant serving organizations for my entire profession, and working in organizations that are leading and working with amazing partners and true activists in this space. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Axelle. It's impossible to stay hopeful all the time in this world, but we really appreciate you setting the context for this conversation and all of our work. We have lofty goals and work in a very constrained environment, that's for sure. So next, I'd like to introduce Myriam Mekni, who is the Executive Director of the Catholic Centre for Immigrantss in Ottawa. Previously, she served as Managing Director of Rising Tide Community Initiatives and as the former Executive Director of the Multicultural Association of the Greater Moncton area. Before immigrating to Canada from her home country of Tunisia, Myriam worked for Apple, the British Council, and the US Embassy. Dedicated to empowering new and established Canadians alike, Myriam's vision is informed by a spirit of inclusion that is friendly, informed, and enduring. Myriam served as chair of Greater Moncton's local immigration partnership. She was appointed as a member of the Human Rights Commission of New Brunswick and co-chaired the Community Task Force on Homelessness and Downtown Security and the Governance Committee for the New Brunswick Women's Council, where she also acted as interim co-chair. She was a member of that governance committee and also co-chair, and she was recently designated one of the most inspiring immigrants in the Maritimes and one of the top 20 under 40 in the Greater Moncton area. And now Ottawa is lucky to have her. So welcome, Myriam. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to OCASI and Debbie and her team for inviting me to this conversation. I moved to Ottawa in July, where I assumed my new role as Executive Director of CCI. I wasn't in the immigration sector before coming to Canada, but it became a personal experience and it's a personal involvement and purpose for me to serve in the sector. So as immigrant serving agencies, there are some ways you can talk about racism, or you can actually embody the work or the actions you want to see in your work. And so I believe in the settlement sector, that's what we do mostly, by serving the newcomers and making sure they are here successful and receive equitable treatment and establish successfully in the community. So I'm looking forward to share what we have done, what we're currently doing, and what I believe could be some ways we could approach countering racism in the country or in the sector in general. So again, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Myriam. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Eternity Neekan, who is Oji Cree Anishinaabe Youth and one of the co-presidents with the Regional Multicultural Youth Council in Thunder Bay, Ontario. They go by any pronouns, she, he, they, and is a two-spirited individual. They organize youth-led activities in high-risk neighborhoods with their team and organize workshops to educate youth in the city on topics like human trafficking and healing from trauma. They were a part of the Pathways to Education program before it was transferred to Škode, and is a peer mentor at their school. They work with youth and listen to their needs, take them out for coffee when they need someone to help or listen, and advocate for their needs in the school. They started a youth council in their high school with the 4 Directions students to further pursue RMYC, which is the Regional Multicultural Youth Council's 3 main goals: keep youth safe, help youth graduate, and give youth a voice. Eternity hosts youth nights to provide something consistent and fun for the students to attend. Now we're lucky to have Eternity with us. Please introduce yourself.
Bonjour, Eternity, in addition to Axelle. I am from Mishigogamon First Nation, and I am a part of the Turtle Clan. Hi, I'm really happy to be here today. I honestly thought you were going to introduce Tisha first, so I'm a little unprepared, but thank you so much for inviting me. And you listed like the more important things that I do. So thank you. Can I go? Oh.
So great to have you, Tisha. And last but definitely not least, Tisha Duncan is OG Cree from Treaty 9, a two-spirit, and the parent of 2 dogs. She is an exemplary young leader, peer mentor, and role model with the Regional Multicultural Youth Council. She organizes youth-led activities like Girl Power and Band of Brothers day camps for kids in high-risk neighborhoods, assists with the organization's after-school and tutoring programs, promotes their peer mentoring and student ambassador programs, and helped launch Pathways to Education to encourage vulnerable students to stay in school. Tisha sees how social isolation, poverty, racism, and negative influences can lead to violence, and reaches out to groups and agencies to help kids feel a sense of safety and belonging. Welcome, Tisha. Please introduce yourself.
Bonjour, Tisha Duncan, Indigenous, Bearskin Lake Nindonji, Mainga Nododam. Hello, my name is Tisha. I am from Bearskin Lake First Nation, and I am from Wolf Clan. You pretty much listed off most of the things I do. I guess something that I really take pride in with my organization is its youth approach, because there's something like more powerful, I guess, like than an adult talking to someone, talking to a youth, than a youth talking to a youth, and encouraging them to, stay in school and advocate and things like that. But yeah, so that's a little bit of what I do. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you guys for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Tisha. What a great group of folks we have here today. So let's get into the conversation. I wanted to start off by asking you all, what are your priorities in addressing anti-racism and oppression? And you can feel free to talk about your priorities in terms of actions and strategies you focus on or want to focus on. And feel free to also talk about any challenges that you face. So I'm going to invite Myriam to go first. What are your priorities?
Thanks, Jen. So at CCI currently, many of you probably served in settlement agencies, and the types of services we provide, they're all aimed at bringing the community together with the new members of the community that just arrived in Canada. So the way we do that is by engaging either our volunteers or the members of the community at large in activities with the newcomers, whether it would be by language classes or like the conversation circles or the workshops or activities for children, like the workshops. We recently hosted a workshop, a series of them for female clients who are interested in sewing. So different activities that the Canadian community could be of help in either volunteering or engaging with the newcomers. That's one part I can speak to. we also organize a lot of youth activities where we request from members of the community to come coach, for example, the youth in hockey nights or soccer, or just to have a fun way that the two members or the two sides, the new co-citizens, if you will, or the residents in here and the immigrants can mix with local members of the community in fun activities and exchange information about their cultures, their social backgrounds. So what we believe in CCI is that there are many ways that you can counter racism. There could be, you could talk about self-reflection, to be self-aware that we all have our own biases. You could organize diversity and inclusion activities. You could become member of or ally of organizations like OCASI, for example, we're very lucky that we have organization like OCASI to be a collective voice for all of us to advocate for policy change and all. But what I believe is that it all starts with education, whether it is at home from the parents to the children or at school from the young age, but it's also, we play a part in that. A great example I could think of is, for example, cross-cultural training that we provide to volunteers or to any member of the community who wants to engage in activity by delivering workshops or by donating time or goods. We are the first point of contact as settlement agencies with the newcomers when they land here. So we're kind of seen like family or parents or caretakers of the newcomers in their first year or until they become citizens, really. So it is up to us to make sure that whoever wants to help or engage or be involved in their settlement journey be educated about the different social backgrounds, different ethnocultural backgrounds, that there are different cultures, histories, stories behind every newcomer that comes. And when the members of the community are open to learning about that, then all of a sudden you're more accepting and your own bias is no longer an obstacle to build that relationship and make sure settlement is successful. So I strongly believe in education as one way to address and counter this and change the social landscape and mentality, especially in societies where there is a history of inequity and of colonialism and of discrimination against one side or the other. So yeah, again, I believe education is key. It's number one before even to go into self-awareness. You need to admit that there is something wrong with your own way of engaging in relationships or judging others, or just to be self-aware there is something to fix. But once you admit that there is a racism aspect in everything we do or witness in the immigrant settlement journey, then only then you can start working on it. So that's what we believe in CCI.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Myriam. I really appreciate your message that racism is embedded all throughout, and that it's important to kind of start with that education piece. So next, I want to invite Axelle to talk about your priorities in addressing anti-racism and anti-oppression. Axelle.
Thank you. I think, I mean, I agree, of course, this is we need to be working on multiple fronts. So at Access Alliance, and I guess based on my own perspective, I've seen a lot of change and coming and going. And I think we have to, as organizations working in this sector and entrusted with public funds and with mandate, not just by funders and donors, but by the communities we work with, our membership, our clients, we have to look at our organizations. We have to normalize and institutionalize anti-racist commitment and action into our organizations, because leaders come and go, but organizations are complex systems that prevail And so, it's like we have to bake it into the bones. I don't want a board member who has a different perspective to come and blow up some initiative, or, when I retire, maybe my successor is going to be focused on, growth and partnerships with, banks. But how does the organization structures and accountability frameworks reflect the commitment that's linked to our mandate and our mission? And so we need to use the frameworks that exist out there, and there are many. I'm sure OCASI has a framework. Ontario Health, which is a body created by the Ministry of Health, and the majority of public dollars supporting services on the ground are health, and health supports community support services, mental health and addictions, youth mental health and wellness, community health centers. Like the Ontario Health Region created a framework to support, an anti-racism framework. And the anti-racism framework talks about all of the different things that you need to do institutionally. You have to collect race-based and other equity indicator-based data and use it to inform your own planning and decision making, but also to inform the work you're doing. And we have to advocate for and that's got to be institutionalized. And we have to advocate for the institutionalization of the collection of this data. We have to have community engagement processes that are truly client-centered and are about co-design. We have to advocate for and have equitable investment and planning. We have to do all of that education and training, but it's got to be, again, oh yeah, let's do anti-racism training this year. No, it's got to be an annual commitment that's built into our calendars that we make time for. And our structural framework, all of our policies, we have to have employment equity policies. We have to have our staff, our board, our volunteers, our students need to reflect the communities we work with. So, all of these are just, kind of off the top of my head, examples of the different ways that we have to bake into our organizations this commitment. And then we have to advocate for funding for this. We have to, and part of baking it in is, one of the things that Access Alliance does, and honestly, sometimes we don't make friends, but it's a commitment by the organization, and we support our staff and our board. So we train them to, at every single table we sit at, we bring up the issue of, systemic barriers to equity, and we name them. And every conversation, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. It could be vaccine engagement. It could be, outreach. It could be, we name it and we make sure that it's on the table. And, a lot of people say, yay, but a lot of people are like, oh my God, there they go again. But we have to, and that's baked into our position statements, our policy influencing frameworks. So I think that is because one of the challenges, we have turnover in our organizations, and our staff take wisdom and experience and commitment with them when they leave, and then new people come in. And how do new people, whether it's board or volunteers or staff, get kind of oriented and put on the right path? It's because it's part of the institutional framework. So I think that's a huge priority, and it's also a huge challenge because we get no funding, no donations to support that kind of infrastructure and organizational capacity building. It's all about our service and encounter targets.
That's great. Thanks so much, Axelle. That really gives a broad overview of all the ways, practical ways we need to embed this work in organizations and how to make it sustainable and long-term, and also some practical ideas of like what that looks like. It's clear that you've been doing this work for a long time, and there's lots of work to do in this realm. So next, I'd like to ask Brittney to share what your priorities are in addressing anti-racism and anti-oppression.
Sure, thank you. So I think that revisiting and making changes to like policies and strategic plans based on viewing them through an anti-racist and anti-oppression framework is important for every organization. And I also would echo my colleagues that ongoing anti-racism training and discussion for all staff, and not just the frontline staff, is so important, and not the same training, but building upon what we have previously done and then taking action. So more than just the creation or revision of policies, but making change is very important. So for example, at the Kitchener-Waterloo Multicultural Center, we have been reflecting on the power imbalance between employers and job seekers. So in furthering equitable practices within our organization, one new thing that we have started doing is that all applicants that we interview for jobs receive a gift card to recognize and appreciate the value of their time. Paying people for interviews, even if it's a small amount, is an important step in the right direction. In the settlement sector, we know the majority of applicants are female, also most are racialized. They might have kids and they might have had to find childcare to come to an interview. They're paying for transit or paying for gas to come to an interview. They might be taking time away from another job to come. So appreciating and valuing the fact that they took time away from their life to come to an interview is really important. In trying to empower equity deserving groups, just another example, we act as trustee for and are also active partners with a number of grassroots organizations in our community. So for example, the Canadian Caribbean Association of Waterloo Region, the Congress of Black Women, Bring on the Sunshine, which is an African festival, Black Girl Excellence Program, the Freedom Marching Project, others as well, but this allows grassroots organizations that are not incorporated the ability to access funding opportunities and continue to do the important work that they are doing at the grassroots level in the community. And this also supports the capacity building of these organizations by having our staff on their boards or supporting them based on what they request from us. Another example is that we have added a statement into our job postings and our volunteer requirement page because we require vulnerable sector checks. And that statement says that we acknowledge the systemic racism and oppression inherent in our society, including in our police and justice system. The result is an overrepresentation of racialized and Black people in these systems, meaning that a police check can negatively impact these communities. For that reason, the vulnerable sector police check is only one aspect of the screening process, and the decision to hire or not does not solely rest on the outcome of the vulnerable sector check. So as we are trying to dismantle systemic barriers that affect marginalized groups, it's important that we clearly acknowledge these issues and share this with prospective volunteers and employees so that they know our stance on anti-racism and so that they know our organizational values. And I'd just like to wrap up this question by saying that in doing this work, it's important to remember that we are the employer and that we need to take care of our staff and our clients. And we cannot allow funders to dictate our policy. Staff and clients come first. So my organization has worked hard over the years to develop our fee for service and to aggressively seek out other funding sources. For example, IRCC has not funded all of our professional development work. IRCC will not reimburse us for the gift cards for interviews. We've also recently switched to a 4-day work week, and IRCC did not have a say in this. Of course, we take our commitments to our funders into consideration, but we did not need their permission to do these things. So it's just important to remember that we are the employer, IRCC is not the employer. And I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Brittney. Sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the systemic issues that we're grappling with. So it's really helpful to hear practical ways that you address them and how they show up in the organization, and that you can concretely pick away at those pieces, the vulnerable sector piece, and really supporting your staff and your clients. That's amazing. So next, I would like to invite Tisha to share your priorities in addressing anti-racism and anti-oppression.
Hi. So usually when we start, we usually go by school years. Usually when we start the school year, we all come together as a council and we kind of plan our priorities and a work plan for the school year. Some of the things that we did this school year is leadership and organizational development, advocacy for social issues, safe spaces for youth to hang out in. We have a student working group, and we review the equity and inclusive education strategy. We also have job and work skills development, promoting racial harmony, volunteering opportunities, and engaging First Nation students and Aboriginal children and youth. So I'm not gonna lie, like there are challenges. I know like one of the biggest challenges is living in Thunder Bay, because I'm sure most of you know, it is one of the most or the most racist cities in Canada. And that's been kind of a challenge. Sometimes we're kind of met with a little bit of backlash. And I feel like the more you advocate, sometimes like the more people know and the more hate you could get, I guess. And sometimes being an advocate in Thunder Bay often requires like putting yourself in a dangerous position, because it's not as safe here. We are, for a few years in a row, we were the murder capital of Canada. So there's just that overall feeling of unsafety, which some of our youth gets nervous about. But overall, and what Myriam said before, we really think education is key too. We do workshops about like ethnocentrism, systemic racism, the truth and reconciliation calls to actions. We try and educate our youth about these because not everyone knows. And yeah, I guess in simple terms, those are some of the things that we're doing in our community. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tisha. And it's, so helpful to help us understand that creating safe spaces for youth in an environment like that is particularly challenging and also really, really important. So thanks for all the work that you do. Eternity, do you want to share anything about your priorities?
Yes. Well, I have the same priorities as Tisha, as we are a part of the same organization. And adding on to what we do, we also, education is really important for us. And we have opportunities like to go to Toronto and Ottawa for conferences to educate ourselves more about topics like colonialism, truth, reconciliation, and overall like just to educate our youth and provide them with opportunities. And yes, safe spaces is another big one. Unfortunately, we don't have a home base right now, but we are really working hard to have a home base for our youth to go to and attend. And we do a lot. And as Tisha said, we do live in Thunder Bay, unfortunately. And it's really difficult sometimes as we do get backlash, and it's living as like an Indigenous female presenting person and advocating can be very dangerous. And ways we combat that is like, I don't know.
Transportation.
Yeah, transportation. Moffat gives us rides. We provide bus tickets. We have group chats so we can make sure our youth gets home safely after meetings every Saturday. And overall, we are very careful. And this ties in with youth safety. And yeah, I feel like I'm drifting off. I'm sorry.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. And I do hope that you get that space that you're advocating for. It's clearly really, really necessary. And it brings me so much sadness to think about all the work that you need to do to keep each other safe. That's just, that's overwhelming to think about. So next, I wanted to ask all of you about the relationship between Indigenous communities and immigrants and refugees. and or how we can address both reconciliation and anti-racism. I think there's a commitment amongst so many of us to want to embed those two, but also acknowledge the difference between those different pieces of work. And maybe it looks different in Thunder Bay compared to Toronto, where you have a multicultural organization that engages possibly both newcomers and Indigenous youth. So can you speak to that relationship between communities as well as between reconciliation and anti-racism? And if you are able to also share what actions others can take to engage in meaningful change and get connected. And or feel free to share any closing thoughts about this topic in general, as I think we might not have a time to have a separate round of closing statements. So first, I'm going to invite Tisha this time to talk about the relationship between communities and reconciliation and anti-racism.
So as Eternity mentioned, sometimes we are given the opportunity to travel. And at our last conference, we were in Toronto for a week, close to a week, 5 days, I believe. And we were facilitating a workshop called Truth Leading to Reconciliation. And it was involved like with people all across Canada, including immigrants and refugees. And I remember a question one of them asked was that, how do Indigenous people feel about immigrants and refugees or newcomers to the country? And I don't know, like I thought it was a really valid and important question. And I just kind of wanted to bring a little bit of light to that and just kind of say, like, you know, as Indigenous people, we've always welcomed newcomers. Oh yeah, so we've always invited newcomers, and I think it's really important, especially if they're, you know, looking for a new experience or like a new life. I also think education is really important. So I know sometimes like there might be a little bit of guilt when learning about the history of Canada, but that's also like not anyone's guilt to carry. And yeah, but I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit and say that since a long time ago, like Indigenous peoples have always welcomed newcomers. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tisha. There's so much graciousness in what you said, and really appreciate you addressing that head on. Eternity, anything you want to add?
Adding on to what Tisha said, yes, we do welcome, and there's no, I feel when learning the history of Canada, usually people are pretty shocked about how much has happened to Indigenous people. And as Tisha said, like, there's no guilt in learning. Like, I don't, because an elder, when we were facilitating this workshop, she said, I want you not to carry this guilt, and like remind yourself that you're helping us make this change by listening to us. And that's really like, yeah. And it's really helpful that you invited Tisha and I here to provide that answer and to hopefully like reassure, if that makes sense.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Eternity. And it's helpful to hear that even just the act of really listening can be helpful, can make a difference. So Axelle, do you want to speak to the relationship between communities and or between reconciliation and anti-racism?
Yeah, you know, this reminds me a little bit, again, years and years and years ago when I was becoming more actively engaged in anti-racism work in the sector. It was when I started doing employment equity work, you know, 30 years ago. One of the conversations that was taking place in that space was who should be doing anti-racism work? Should it be white people? Should it be Black people? And there was a lot of, it was controversial because obviously there were a lot of consulting contracts and training fees, right? So everybody wanted to jump into this space. And you know, I went to a conference once where they did caucusing, right? Where, you know, they'd caucus of white women, Black women, lesbians, to create a space, acknowledging that sometimes when we do anti-racism learning and work based on ignorance, we can hurt people. And how do you minimize hurting people in a process of, how do I not hurt people in my own process of learning, for example? So that's just kind of one thing that's in my head. Having said that, this work is intersectional. We have to understand intersectionality and realize that, we need the diversity of peoples and understanding together to move this bigger piece forward. In terms of newcomer and immigrant serving organizations and populations, there's a lot of work we have to do ourselves first, which is, and I think we have to own that work. A lot of organizations sometimes reach out to Indigenous or Aboriginal focused organizations and say, hey, partner with us, come and do the training, come and I feel that, and a lot of organizations don't respond because they don't have the time, they don't have the resources, that's not their mandate, or frankly, they're doing their own work. And I think we have to, as a sector and as organizations, figure out what's our own work first. And I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of education and decolonizing our own thinking to prepare. And then from a place of having deconstructed some of our own mindsets, and then from a place of more information and respect, then we can look at opportunities to work collaboratively to further that shared work. As Tisha so graciously said, like, there's so much openness and respect and value to our working together, but we have to enter it into it well, and the thing is, there's still, and I refer to sort of structural pieces that our funders and our governments are still doing to reinforce problematic practices. In the community health sector, there was a period where the government was giving non-Indigenous focused community health centers money to work with Indigenous communities and populations. And the Indigenous focused community health centers and Aboriginal health access centers said, hey, what's going on? Why aren't we being offered that money? And we had to do work within our sector, and we agreed that we were not going to accept those dollars, that non-Indigenous focused community health centers would not accept those dollars. And we would say those dollars have to go to the people, the organizations that are leading this work. So, so we have to inform ourselves, we have to do our own work, we have to not accept a lot of the frameworks that are imposed on us. And then when we did that, when the non-Indigenous based organizations did that, it created a lot more trust and mutual respect. So I think, that's how we have to step into this space. There are initiatives now, which are, I think we can, support and get engaged with to support us to do that work. For example, in Toronto, the City of Toronto Newcomer Office and the City of Toronto Indigenous Affairs Office are working together to develop resources. But I think we have to do our own work and then partner, because it's only through partnership and collaboration will we really make change.
Thanks so much, Axelle. It's so important to kind of define what we need to do on our own, and then also be really clear about when we do need to partner and share resources and say no to a system that's not designed to support Indigenous-led organizations to succeed necessarily. That was really helpful. Thank you. Brittney, would you like to talk about this issue?
Yes. So I will speak to a few ways that the KW Multicultural Center has approached reconciliation and tried to bridge the gap between newcomers and the Indigenous community. we were involved in a quilting project pre-COVID that brought newcomers and Indigenous people together to share stories and teachings and history. Folks made individual quilt squares to tell their stories, and those squares were turned into 2 very large and really beautiful quilts that are now actually on display at the Multicultural Center. And it was a fantastic project to bring these 2 communities together so that they could have a dialogue. We have also done a series of training for our staff and our interpreters. And we have looked at, or we've had sessions on foundational knowledge. We've had virtual residential school tours. We had a tour of the Woodland Cultural Center. We've learned about Indigenous pedagogy, and we've learned about the TRC and calls to action. And this was a really important step to make sure that staff across the board had the foundational knowledge to understand the history and current issues of Indigenous people in Canada. In consultation with Indigenous community members, we named 10 meeting rooms in our office after local Indigenous nations. And by named, I mean that these names are directly on the walls and they're quite large. And we did this in hopes to encourage clients and staff and partners and anyone who visits the center to ask questions and to have discussions so that we can continue the dialogue and education and history around history and current issues. So as a settlement agency, we are welcoming people, and we are one of the first places that newcomers are coming in Waterloo region, and we feel that it's really important that this discussion starts with us. Another example is partnering with a local Indigenous organization called Healing of the 7 Generations. We did a session at the library with newcomer youth and their families to learn more about Indigenous culture through painting and reflection. And we're looking forward to having a series of Indigenous sessions for newcomers in Waterloo region. We also have our Indigenous focus brochure and information on our website so that the community can learn about all of the reconciliation work that we are doing and why we are doing it. And I'd also just like to share about how I would suggest approaching reconciliation work as an agency in the settlement sector. So it's important that as a settlement agency welcoming immigrants and refugees, that we acknowledge that we are all settlers on this land and acknowledge and learn and teach and share about the impacts of settler colonialism, residential schools, and genocide has had and continues to have on Indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island. Every part of our organization has been participating in this work. So by this, I mean staff across all programs and departments, including non-client facing staff, our entire management team, the board, and more recently, we have been engaging volunteers and clients in this process as well. And this is important because it shouldn't just be a few people in an organization engaged in reconciliation and anti-racism work. This needs to be a priority throughout the whole organization. I would also encourage folks to take your staff on field trips to Indigenous organizations. For us in Waterloo region, this has been places like Anishinaabe Outreach, the Healing of the 7 Generations, Crow Shield Lodge. Get out in community and connect with Indigenous organizations and community members, and also take advantage of opportunities like Indigenous exhibits at local museums, for example. I also wanted to say that it's important to use National Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is September 30th, as an educational opportunity for your staff as well. This past year, we watched a documentary that was called Cottagers and Indians, and we did that with all staff, and we had group discussions about the film as we reflected about some of the issues. But you could do anything around that day. You could watch a documentary, you could have a guest speaker, you could go on a field trip. It doesn't have to be on that day, but around that date. And I'll just conclude by saying that we have not done anything without some form of communication with Indigenous leaders and community members. So a lot of my time has been spent connecting and building those relationships so it doesn't just seem like we're approaching the Indigenous community and just taking things. That's not what we're trying to do. Indigenous leaders are not a resource, they're people first. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Wow, so many great ideas of how settlement organizations, immigrant and refugee serving organizations can find ways to educate themselves and their staff and their clients, build connections with Indigenous communities and build greater relationships. And I love that aspect of both focusing on history and concrete facts as well as an arts-based approach. There's lots of, it's like such a wide breadth of approaches there. It's really quite lovely. And as you were talking to, I did see the comment from Debbie in the chat, just sharing some of the experiences and lessons learned, going back to what Axelle was talking about in terms of the early days of anti-racism struggles and having to choose between different caucuses where we didn't have that intersectional lens. And we thought queer folks were different from Black folks or people of color, or we grouped all the people of color together in one area. And so maybe a lot to learn from those days as we kind of build our muscle around addressing the issues and priorities of Indigenous communities. And I think so many of us have gotten to the truth part. We're slowly getting through reconciliation, but then thinking about how do we really embed understanding history and current realities of Indigenous communities, thinking about self-determination and the ways that Indigenous folks want to be engaged. That gets more complex. How do we embed it in our advocacy and policy work? I heard Debbie talking earlier at the beginning about how important it is for OCASI to embed truth and reconciliation into every aspect of their policy and advocacy work. And that's a lot of unlearning and thinking through and lots of work. So we're just barely scratching the surface, it feels like, but it's really great to have this conversation with you all. And I'd also like to get to some questions and answers, which I see that a few have come through the Q&A. If there are any more questions, please share them with us through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll just ask the panelists, are there any of you that just want to end with some closing statements? And Myriam, I'll just start with you and ask you, are there any closing thoughts you want to share?
Sure, yeah. I was reading Debbie's comment, and it goes in line exactly with what I was about to share. If you dig out proofs of racism in the way societies deal with each other, you'll find that in every country probably around the globe. And in Canada, if you look again at the last century, you'll see there's quite a big progress made, but we're not there yet. We pride ourselves on being a welcoming society and a mosaic of cultures and all of that. But there is a reason that the word truth comes before reconciliation in that action that everyone needs to take. It's because we need to admit first that what we're doing is probably still not working, that we need to do more. And I strongly believe that it starts with the leaders and the decision makers of the country. If a prime example of that, for example, in the work I do, is one of many examples is, for example, when immigrants come, they are required to have this many credentials and masters and bachelors, etc., but nothing is recognized here because it's not good enough compared to what's in Canada. So that is one example, but I can list so many. I strongly believe that change needs to start from the top. That's whether it's good or bad, the policies that are created. In the end of the day, all of us as part of a society, we're going to abide by those policies and laws. So that the biggest impact could start from changing policy. And one way we could do that if we want to go back to the education point, for example, there was one initiative that was done in New Brunswick where I was before. I always refer to New Brunswick because that's where I spent the most years, the biggest number of years in this sector. Cross-cultural training, for example, was something that was offered by settlement agencies to staff, volunteers, employers who hire immigrants, etc. But its impact was only strong when the government made it mandatory for employers to be endorsed by the government. So the government does have a role to play in dictating how employers go about treating their employees, how they can be discovering where they come from to make sure their treatment of their employees is equitable. Us in settlement agencies, like you said, Brittney, it starts with our staff. We need to be able to ensure that our staff, volunteers, and everyone that serves our clients are also educated about what is racism, what bias you may have that you're not aware of, and how you can be more open and aware of that bias inside, so that you can counter it and can participate in the effort of the whole society in countering it. So having Debbie heard me say this probably many times, but I think having one solid voice unified between the entire sector of all the agencies could have impact on changing policy. But it still starts with educating ourselves and educating our children in school and educating our volunteers and our staff. So education is definitely key, and government plays a big role in making that more impactful than just us nonprofits.
That's great. Thanks so much, Myriam. It's so helpful. That reminder that in addition to the work that we do as individual organizations or a sector, that institutions and governments play a critical role, and that we need to advocate and ensure that that happens. Any other speakers who would like to share some final thoughts before we go to the Q&A? I'm just looking at all of you, and I don't see any of you unmuting. Yes?
Sure. I would just say final thoughts. Remember that we are the employer, and I really encourage everyone to try to diversify your income to have more flexibility to do what you would like to do. It's hard work, but it can be done. I also think that it's important to remember nothing about us without us when approaching this kind of work. And anti-racism, equity, and reconciliation work is a journey, and it's a process. I think it can seem really daunting when we're looking at it, but start with one thing and that will lead to another, and that will lead to another. This work is really important, and it takes time to do it right. And then the last thing is just that you cannot just have a few people in your organization prioritizing this work. It really needs to be happening at all levels within your organization.
Those are great nuggets to share. Thanks so much, Brittney. And I love diversifying your funding as a anti-racism and equity strategy. That's excellent. Those two are aligned. Systems change strategy. So I'm going to go to questions, unless any of the other speakers would like to share some final thoughts. I don't see any of you unmuting. So here's one, and I think that it was addressed in our Q&A chat, but I'd like to bring it out into conversations. So someone was asking what makes advocating for communities dangerous in Canada. And as I recall, two of you kind of spoke, or maybe three of you spoke to that. Axelle, you spoke to that. And then I also heard Tisha and Eternity talking about how dangerous it is to do this advocacy work and to put yourself out there. So maybe I'll invite Axelle to go first, and then Tisha and Eternity to talk about what that looks like in terms of danger.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when we're deconstructing white supremacy, it's an issue of rights and power. And there's an imbalance of rights and power. And so there are groups in society who have to give up rights and power. I mean, that's where we're going. And a lot of people, especially the people with all the rights and the power, don't want to give up their rights and power. So the pushback can be hard and it can be violent. So, you know, the example I posted is just one example of as an organ, somebody with power and connections to funders was actively calling for our defunding because we were bold enough to put an anti-oppression policy on our website. And that's just one example. I mean, a lot of times organizations that consistently want to address these issues can be sidelined, targeted, but I mean, that's nothing compared to Tisha's, as you and Britt, you and Eternity were talking about, like, it's also physical. We run programs that are in community spaces, in the community, and walkthroughs by community police who then want to card everybody there. Like those youth, for example, in that program are then known to police, right? And that's risky and that's scary. Like those are just little examples.
Axelle, actually, I'm not sure if everyone can see your response in the Q&A box. So if you want to just share a little bit about that defunding story, or.
So, I mean, years ago, Access Alliance posted our anti-oppression policy on our website, and a radio broadcaster actually in Hamilton saw it for, a random reason and spoke about it on the radio. And, randomly, because he had emailed me and I hadn't, sort of challenging, and I sort of ignored it. And he said, well, I'm going to be speaking about it. And I ignored it. But then I listened to his radio show. And honestly, my blood ran cold when I listened to it, because he named us and he trashed us. And he said all kinds of things about us. And he said that we should be defunded and that he was going to do something about it. And the next week, he had Jason Kennedy, who was a minister of the Conservative federal government at that time, on the show. And they talked about it. And Jason Kennedy was very, talked about, pinko, commie, radicals, and, characterized us in that way and said he would look into our funding. And I think he was IRCC, I can't remember, but that was a very scary time for the organization. Thank God an election was coming and eventually nothing happened. I mean, and Jason Kennedy, he didn't care, but you know what I mean? He was pandering. But it was a very scary time for us, as diversely funded as we are. Like, you don't want to lose your IRCC contract for such a stupid reason. And, my board was freaking out. And then there was discussion. So interestingly, then there was a discussion on my board around, should we take our anti-oppression policy down? Like, some of our board members said we should take it down from our website. And it was a very interesting conversation at our board. And again, these were community members who were just concerned for the organization. And that was a very interesting conversation. We didn't take it down, but there was, some debate about that.
Wow, unbelievable. I didn't know about that story, from an anti-oppression policy to talking about potentially defunding. It's mind-boggling. Tisha, in Eternity, do you want to talk about how this work can be or feel dangerous?
Tisha, unmute too.
Okay. All right. Do you want to go first or do you want me to?
Yeah, as I said, as a female Indigenous person, as I am a target for human trafficking for one, racism, and homophobia for some who know me and who know that I am Two-Spirit. And just, it's like having those things already pinned on me, I guess. Advocating for myself and advocating for my people can also be very dangerous, in a sense that a lot of people don't agree. Still to this day, a lot of people don't agree that we should be getting all these things, aka just a couple taxes off my Walmart purchase. It's so silly to me, but they see it differently. Tisha. Oh.
Okay. Yeah, so I know one of the problems in Thunder Bay is there's a lot of racism and hate crimes going around, especially within the public transportation system. And another thing too is that the police in Thunder Bay are also corrupt. We've had multiple police chiefs fired for being racist, and then they just replace that person with another racist. So there's not a lot of, or it feels like there's not a lot of support if you're in trouble, because police won't listen to you. And I guess an example I can think of, when I've advocated and then kind of get hated on, is within my school. I'm kind of well known as having multiple initiatives for my Indigenous peers, and like I'll have kids come up to me and call me annoying and tell me to like shut up and things like that. And that in itself provides a feeling of like unsafe, like not being safe in my community. But yeah, sometimes it's really frustrating. And I feel like the more I try and advocate, like the more hate I get, but also the more support I get from people who do think like me. But yeah, so I guess that's kind of like what I'm referring to is just like the systematic racism that kind of prevents some people from advocating.
Yeah. And I don't know, it's overall just like outside of advocating, just be like having experiences. And because I remember Tisha and I were at the mall one time, and like I came back from a job interview and I just stood beside her in line. I wasn't getting anything. And then this lady got like really upset with us, and afterwards she would like hover around us and like make comments and overall try to like be threatening. And that's like an example of like how unsafe it can be for us in like a colonial space.
Yeah.
And when we attend conferences, like those are colonial spaces too. And we're there advocating for ourselves. And that can lead to even more just like, I guess like pins like on us because
Yeah.
we're sharing our voice and we're like out.
Sometimes I feel like when I do get hate, like I feel like people don't like it when you're loud. Like people don't like the quote unquote like loud Indian, which kind of hurts. But yeah, but that's just a little bit of our experiences. So yeah.
Yes, I hope that gives some light.
That's I appreciate so much you sharing, you know, in addition to that personal experience of all that anti-Indigenous racism that you experience every day on a daily basis, just from the average person. But then also when you're speaking up to be faced with that kind of hatred or discrimination, including from our institutions and the police. You know, in one of our previous sessions, we heard from some panelists who talked about not feeling safe, of course, with the police, that Black folks, Indigenous women, female presenting, don't feel safe with police. And that's a tough space to do this work in. So just really appreciating you joining us here today, and all the courage it takes for you to just do this work in a really difficult environment. So thanks so much. I have another question I think I'm going to try to make a little bit more time for before we wrap up. But we just really have a couple of minutes for it. So what are some of the first steps a settlement organization can take to help support or bring education and awareness around equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-racism in their community? One of the first steps, working in a community with not a lot of supports or knowledge on these topics. So where's a good place to start when there's not a lot of support or knowledge to begin with? Who wants to take that? I'm wondering if it's Brittney or Myriam, so outside of Toronto where there's less supports.
I saw Axelle's hand up, but I'm happy to jump in.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
No, go for it.
Okay, I think, yeah, training and having different educational sessions is really important. Something that we have done is we work so closely on all of these, like all this equity and anti-racism work with our local immigration partnership, because they have such a broad network of different community partners, right? So when we're trying to push this work forward within our community, the reach is that much greater when we can connect with partners. In Waterloo region, we also have smaller surrounding areas, like smaller, just small towns around the region. And we've been able to connect with them in this work through the local library system as well, to offer some sessions and educational opportunities and that sort of thing.
That's great. Thanks, Brittney. And maybe I'll give you a chance, Axelle, to speak in a couple of minutes and also layer on another question, which is how do you translate education to action, especially for racialized communities? If there's a way you can address both questions.
Well, I mean, I agree. There are resources out there. There are a lot of people who can support you. Start with, all these examples, workshops, initiatives, and think about who the audiences are and just try to make sure that the audience can see why they want to be part of this conversation. We do when we work with community, we do a lot of evaluations, and there's such an easy evaluation like feedback form, which you do is, what did the head, heart, hands, right? So what did this make you think of? What did you feel? And what are you gonna do? I mean, I think the wisdom and the opportunities are in the communities that we work with. What are they going to do? So if you're doing workshops in your community, start there. And the communities we work with, we know have got wisdom and capacity and extraordinary lived experience. And then that's where we start. And you can start with these small initiatives that are, so we have a green roof program, and we, out of one of these conversations, some of our newcomer folks said, we want to learn more actually about Indigenous approaches to environmental issues and to food production and to all of that green stuff, right? And so that opened the door then for us to work with different communities on different initiatives. So I think that's one approach, right?
Thanks so much, Axelle. Oh, Brittney, did you want to say one final short thing?
Yes, can I just add one more thing that through our local immigration partnership, we actually created a website called Racial Equity Waterloo Region. And on there, we have a whole bunch of different resources for the community. So for example, like online hate reporting tools, different resources for teachers or for employers, or, there's books on there, there's TED Talks, there's different things. We also did a racial equity a lawn sign campaign that says we all belong, and it literally says take action against hate on the lawn sign, and that was distributed across Waterloo Region. So things like that are practical things that that you can do to take it a step further, and I'll put that link in the chat so you can all take a look at that website.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks all our panelists for all your great insight and sharing your personal experiences and what you've been doing around this work. Thank you to our interpreters and all our participants. It's been so great to have you. Thank you for your questions. That last question, we barely scratched the surface, but we are going to provide some resources after the session. We will also be sending out an evaluation survey. So just a reminder to look out for that, and please fill that in so we know how we're doing and if there's areas for improvement for us in the future. This was recorded and will be available on the website, as were the other two previous sessions. So yes, look out for an email from OCASI. You'll get some resources, the survey, and links to other things.